All right, everyone in the room, we are about to get started. Those of us who are still trickling in, there are seats available. You just might have to ask people to stand and let you in. So I want to welcome everyone here to a special Liberty 250 lecture with Fraunces Tavern Museum. Remember, if you're joining us virtually and you have any questions during the lecture, to leave them in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring the Q&A during the lecture, so don't worry about saving your questions till the end. If you're joining us in person, you'll be able to ask your questions at the end of the lecture as well. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. And as always, please note that the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York or its Fraunces Tavern Museum. And with that said, Charles Dewey, our speaker tonight, has been a historian at Fort Lee Historic Park for 7 years, where he regularly teaches school groups, provides lectures and staff rides, and writes on the history of the Revolution in the Hudson Valley with a special interest in intelligence operations. Outside of the park, he often speaks at local libraries and historical societies, and has written for the Journal of the American Revolution and the Hudson River Valley Review. In addition, he is an officer in the U.S. Army National Guard, where he serves as a military intelligence officer and a law student at Rutgers Law School. And with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Charles Dewey.
Oh, wow. Packed house. Thank you for making it out here today. As the kind introduction said, my name is Charlie Dewey. I'm a historian at Fort Lee Historic Park. As you might know, Fort Lee played an important role during the New York campaign of 1776. I actually didn't know this, but right here on the wall, we have an image of George Washington standing at Fort Lee watching the Battle of Fort Washington, a place where he allegedly wept as he watched his forces get taken captive by the British. This is actually one of the originals. We don't even have the original over at Fort Lee itself, so that's kind of cool. Take a look at that there. 4 days later, after the fall of Fort Washington, the British scaled the cliffs of the Palisades and advanced on the fort, only to find that the American forces had hastily begun their retreat across New Jersey, a retreat that ultimately concluded with the crossing of the Delaware and the battles of Trenton and Princeton, which some credit as the most critical moment of the war. Today, Fort Lee Historic Park is part of the Palisades Interstate Park Commission. Some of our other sites include Fort Montgomery, Stony Point, New Windsor Cantonment, Knox's headquarters, and Washington's headquarters in Newburgh, were later the site of the Newburgh conspiracy. These are all wonderful sites. I have the great fortune of having worked with them for many years now. I'm sure that if you will visit them in the next year or so, you're going to learn just as much as I have from them, especially as we prepare for the 250th. Enough about Fort Lee. And the other side of the river, we're here to talk about Spies of the Greater New York area. This place here is my favorite place in New York City, and I know my friends can testify to that. This is actually the last place I ate before I deployed several years ago, and I thought about the dry rub rings in the restaurant downstairs probably 2 or 3 times while I was gone. But whether it's hanging with friends or downstairs or attending lectures, this building has a very special feeling to it. It's hard not to feel transported in time just by being here. And that's also because of the wonderful staff that they have here. So a special round of applause for them as well for putting on events like this. It really is an honor to be standing here today. I can't tell you that enough. So thank you for all you for joining us today, and all of those who cannot be present. I also thank you, and then many of those who've helped me along the way. I want to give special thanks to Alexander Rose, John Nagy, Damian Crego, Bill Blyer, Don Haggis from the Journal of American Revolution, and Todd Braystead, whose work on loyalists in the New York City area and his transcriptions of many of the historical documents of the 18th century have made life a lot easier for those of us that can't read 18th century handwriting so well. As I was mentioned in the introduction, I am also a military intelligence officer, not a spy. I've never been a spy. Isn't that what a spy would say, is something you might think? No, I think I might be a little too honest for that. Don't hold me to it. But I will occasionally dip into modern military intelligence practices to highlight relevant similarities or differences. So we'll start this off with a quote. If you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you'll succumb in every battle. Sun Tzu wrote this. Now, I'm not saying that George Washington studied Sun Tzu, but this is just something that illustrates a fundamental truth throughout the history of warfare. Intelligence has always been an integral part of success. Not only do we have a military intelligence apparatus in the modern era, but we also have a civilian one comprised of several different combinations of 3 letters. I'm sure you can guess which ones I'm referring to. We also have a fully developed legal system with sections and volumes of the US Code that detail the legal bounds of how and under what circumstances that intelligence can be collected. As you will see, at the time of the Revolution, no 3-letter agencies existed, nor were there well-developed laws to regulate the practice. Much of what you're about to hear is reflective of this. They were doing intelligence operations by the seat of their pants, and plenty of the time it showed. Countless books, movies, and television series portray the revolution or the intelligence operations since the revolution, and they do a lot to embellish the practice. And who could blame them? You know, Jack Ryan and Jason Bourne are certainly pretty entertaining. But within the past few years, we've seen more attention paid to the spies of the American Revolution, in part due to the TV show Turn. Has anyone here seen Turn by show of hands? Okay, so might be doing a little myth busting today. The show, which I happen to enjoy quite a bit, despite its artistic liberties, was drawn from Alexander Rose's book, Washington Spies, the story of America's first spy ring. If you aren't familiar with the book or the TV series, Rose credits the Culper spy ring based on Long Island as one of the first, but I happen to disagree with this, and we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Over the years, I've gotten countless questions about the Culpers, and for good reason. They ran a highly organized, efficient, and consequential operation that played a large role in the success of the American war effort. In one case, a writer from Time magazine actually sent me a list of questions because she wanted to publish an article on the Culpers, but most of the questions were drawn from the television series and not from the book. I had to reply to each one of them that this isn't true or this is only partly true. I never got an email back, and the piece was never written. Maybe it's that the plain truth doesn't sell very well, but the plain truth, I think, can still be very interesting. The spies and agents of the time conducted timely, organized intelligence and espionage, knowing full well what their punishment would be. They did so using innovative methods and without any sort of formal training. The Culpers were not the only ones to conduct these intelligence operations, and they weren't even the only ones to do so in the greater New York area. So while I may include some information on the Culpers in this presentation, I spent most of my time studying those who haven't received as much attention. I find the service of these men and women to be utterly fascinating, and I hope that by the end of this, you will as well. As a professor at the Joint Forces Staff College has put so well, everything about intelligence operations and espionage in the modern age can also be found in the Revolution. Codes and ciphers, clandestine meetings, the use of double agents, all of the above were all present. The main difference was the technology. But as we will also talk about, the officers of the time pursued the best technological innovation that they could to enhance their chances of mission success, and also to preserve the safety of those that were carrying out the operations. Those two things are pretty mutually exclusive. What's more is that the agents, the spies, and the officers of the American Revolution, in my view, helped to change the way that history looks upon the practice. We think of spies of that day, we think of them mostly as honorable. They undertook a cause knowing full well that death was likely the consequence. What could be more honorable than this? But that was not always the case. Spies of the 18th century were often viewed as scoundrels or lowlifes, readily willing to lie and betray for a financial reward, and ready to go to wherever place would provide them the best chance of safety. This was definitely true in many of the cases. Who would be a better person, for example, to collect drinks spilled over a few drinks in a bar? The barfly who haunts that establishment pretty frequently, or a clean-pressed man who arrives from out of town and seems to be asking one too many questions. We'll be talking about that also in a few minutes. So first, let's start with civilian intelligence. The modern civilian intelligence apparatus can trace its origins to the American Revolution. There were indeed several civilian committees created for the purposes of gaining intelligence during that time, and here are just some of the examples. First, you had the Secret Committee, organized in September 1775, not very creatively named there, but it was tasked with obtaining military supplies and sent agents abroad to gather intelligence on British stores. Several months later, they created the Committee of Secret Correspondence, again, not very creatively named. The Congress created this to collect foreign intelligence on sympathies for the revolution abroad. This was eventually renamed the Committee on Foreign Affairs, but the intelligence collection purposes that they had still continued. In the war's early years, the committee sent a man named Silas Deane, you might be familiar with him, abroad under the cover as a merchant to collect information or to build support for the American Revolution among the French. Deane is considered to be one of the first foreign agents that this country has had, but while he was abroad, he did wind up saying a few things that wound up in a paper. He advocated for reconciliation with the Brits at some point, and he was banned from returning to the United States. He died aboard a ship on his way back to the United States many years later. So kind of an unfortunate end to him. Third, we also have the Committee on Spies. This was mostly an ad hoc committee, which primarily dealt with creating the punishments for those caught spying on continental forces. Among the many contributions that this contribution made to the war effort was a revision to the Articles of War at the time, which read, "All persons not members of nor owing allegiance to the United States of America, who shall be found lurking as spies in or about the fortifications or encampments of the armies of the United States, shall suffer death according to law and the usage of nations by sentence of court-martial." Again, we will also see how that plays out later. And last up here is the Committee on Detecting and Defeating Conspiracies, which is regarded as the nation's first counterintelligence agency, though it was organized at the state level in New York. I'm sure if it existed in the modern era, we'd find some crazy acronym for it. I'm going to refer to it as the CDDC throughout this for ease. Serving on these committees were many of the prominent personalities of the day. You can see them up here on the screen. We have Benjamin Franklin, obviously. We also have John Jay. Franklin served on the Secret Committee and the Committee of Secret Correspondence, and Jay served on the Committee of Correspondence and the Committee, or the CDDC. A sampling of those not pictured but thoroughly involved are Thomas Jefferson, William Dewar, Robert Morris, Nathaniel Sackett, and Robert Livingston. And in 1777, Sackett would go on to become the organizer of a network of civilian spies around New York City. In this role, though Sackett paradoxically reported to George Washington and not to civilian authorities, but Washington relieved him after only 2 months in the job. He was pretty bad at actually gaining intelligence and better at coming up with different tradecraft. But what is clear from the immense amount of committees and the people involved with these civilian agencies is that the Congress at the time believed that an intelligence advantage was a key formula for winning the war. But how exactly did the agents involved with these committees operate? Well, let me provide an example. So pictured here is Enoch Crosby. We can learn a lot from the ventures of old Enoch. He was born on Cape Cod, and he was a shoemaker by trade that turned later into a Patriot spy. He was raised a little bit north of New York City after he moved away from Cape Cod and spent the rest of his years in Connecticut. Throughout his time as an agent, he worked with many prominent authorities to include Sackett and Jay. In the war's early years, he served in a militia and took part in a failed invasion of Canada before he was eventually discharged. After an instance in which a Westchester County Committee of Safety, because these committees also exist at the local level, after an instance when he worked with the Westchester County Committee, where he was relatively successful in ferreting out several of the loyalist bands that were operating in the area, he was recommended to work with the CDDC, which then began to use him to gather intelligence and disrupt loyalist bands operating north of New York City throughout the Hudson Valley. Because he was working with the CDDC, this has led some historians to classify him as a counterintelligence agent, though I tend to disagree with that. Counterintelligence, as we understand it today, means to detect and defeat enemy intelligence threats, not to just go and disrupt loyalist bands from doing what they're doing, their casual operations. Crosby's role seems more in line with what we would consider today to be covert action, because he was sent to gain intelligence on these loyalist bands and report back to the committee, who would then dispatch Patriot forces to the location where he was, where they would capture the loyalists. He was not used to just ferret out loyalist intelligence threats. The Hudson Valley, and particularly Westchester, north of New York City, became known as the neutral ground. This is because American lines were located further to the north, and the British lines were located further to the south towards New York City. It was also known as the neutral ground because the loyalties of this entire area were basically split between one side or the other. No one really knew which house you went to or which person you talked to, where their loyalties lied. This provided a very advantageous ground for someone like Crosby to carry out their operations. Over the course of 9 months, Crosby aided in the capture of 3 companies worth of loyalists who were preparing to join British forces. His method for doing so was quite simple. He had the gift of the gab. He was able to walk up to people, convince them that he was operating in favor of the Brits, and then he would hand deliver all this intelligence to J and the CDDC, where they would eventually surround whatever place he was located and they would capture them. Crosby would be captured with those forces so as to not give away his cover. On several occasions, they actually they created a fake story for him to escape, one of which to let him go to the bathroom. He went to an outhouse and then he snuck off into a cornfield and they fired musket shots behind him. There even one case is reported that he had a fake trial where they let him go afterwards. So quite a bit of hijinks going on in the neutral ground throughout this time. He also, after engaged in one too many operations, civilian authorities decided that Crosby's use as an agent was no longer any good, and they forced him into retirement as a spy, though he did serve in a uniform capacity for several stints throughout the remainder of the war. But where his legacy, I think, really lies is that in almost 45 years after Crosby's service, James Fenimore Cooper, you might know him from Last of the Mohicans, and whose father is the namesake of Cooperstown, New York, home of the Baseball Hall of Fame, published what is widely regarded as the first American spy novel. You can see the cover of it here. This was called The Spy, A Tale of the Neutral Ground. And it was written largely based on Crosby's exploits. Cooper learned of Crosby's exploits through the son of his neighbor, John Jay. Though Jay never revealed the name of the agent himself. The book was a huge commercial success, and Cooper's career might not have taken off had this book not have been published. But Crosby himself also tried to capitalize on the success of The Spy. Several years later, he wrote what is called The Spy Unmasked, or the memoirs of Enoch Crosby, alias Harvey Birch. Harvey Birch, as you might be able to guess, was the main character of The Spy. As a historical record, the memoirs are basically useless. Written decades later, the story doesn't just suffer from a lack of good memory. There's basically just all exaggerations and lies. Who can blame them? You're trying to sell a book. It makes sense. Well, one such lie was that while he was staying in the home of a local militia leader who had taken him capture, who was also using John Jay, of course, as his headquarters. He only managed to escape because a housemaid fed the man copious amounts of broiled chicken and John Jay's finest brandy that had apparently been laced with opiates. One could imagine why he would not want to include that in his pension applications that need to have more support and to at least be considered somewhat credible. But fortunately for the modern historian, we have many other sources to corroborate his work, to include those pension applications where he could not take crazy artistic liberties. And we also have the minutes of the CDDC, although there are some gaps in the story. I highly encourage you all to check out those sources if you're interested in learning more about Enoch. But in addition to civilian intelligence, we also have the birth of American military intelligence. What exactly is military intelligence? This is intelligence that is gained and directed by military leaders for the purpose of supporting military operations. It usually involves troop dispositions and compositions, quantities of military supply, any sort of remarks on what the intentions of the adversary are. And during the revolution, the line between civilian and military intelligence was often blurred. You had multiple different overlapping personalities, roles, and responsibilities. But the distinctions between civilian and military intelligence, these are something that are really present in the modern day, not necessarily present back then. Who could really fault them for not following a distinction that didn't exist? Another difference is that in the modern military, it would be almost unheard of to deploy a soldier in civilian clothes to operate behind enemy lines. This would mean that the soldier would lack the protection of the Geneva Conventions if they wound up being captured. But what is a standard practice, both then and now, is the use of human intelligence, known as HUMINT, which is the use of sources both friendly and adversarial to gain a better picture of what the enemy's intent is. During the days of the revolution, this would often entail paying sources who had placement and access to important attributes for a source that had access to important military information, and then they would come and they would report back to whoever sent them out there what they saw during their travels. Often these were couriers or other people that had a cover or plausible deniability for what they were doing in a particular location. But as these were not military people, sometimes they didn't know what they were looking for, and oftentimes they were basically working for whoever was providing them the most money. So again, not the most reliable. But beyond the use of HUMINT, military intelligence also involves standard information collection techniques. We consider these today to be reconnaissance and scouting missions. In fact, the US Army Military Intelligence Corps in the modern day traces its origins to the Revolution as well, and particularly to the service of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton and his group that was known as the Rangers. You see Knowlton over here on the left-hand side. Knowlton was a Massachusetts native who grew up in Connecticut. He distinguished himself through courageous actions at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and in early 1776, he was made a major in the 20th Continental Regiment. And by the end of that summer, he was given a command of anywhere between 120 and 150 soldiers, all handpicked volunteers to conduct highly dangerous operations around New York City, to include reconnaissance and scouting, and raids if that was deemed necessary. All of this was because the British invasion appeared all the more imminent during that late summer period. Washington himself had expressed deep anxieties about how the British planned to take New York at this time, and he desired that Knowlton's unit report to him directly. Now, again, I want to stress how incredible this is at the time. Washington was very involved with the tactical decision-making of the army, but having a personal intelligence unit basically to report back to him on what was going on is something that we would not have today. I can't imagine reporting to the commander-in-chief of the military for something as simple as a maneuver on a battlefield. But Washington he cut off the middleman for this particular type of operation, and he had this unit to answer his intelligence requirements. One such requirement was understanding the composition and disposition of British forces on Long Island. And in September 1776, only a couple weeks after the disastrous Battle of Long Island and the escape across the East River to Manhattan, Knowlton requested that one of his officers go behind enemy lines to scout British positions. At the time, no one volunteered. Doesn't sound like something that I would want to do either. According to 19th century sources, even one officer named James Sprague voiced, "I'm willing to fight the British and if need be, die a soldier's death in battle. But as for going among them in disguise and being taken up and hung like a dog, I'll not do it." Once again, this speaks towards the attitudes towards spying that I mentioned earlier. It was viewed as a task for scoundrels and lowlifes. Knowlton had within his ranks a young idealistic Yale graduate and schoolmaster turned soldier from Connecticut by the name of Nathan Hale. Hale was anything but a scoundrel or a lowlife, and he joined the Continental Forces out of a sense of duty. Up until this point in the war, Hale had felt he contributed very little to the war effort, and basically he was bored. He wanted something more to do. I can tell you there's quite a few bad military decisions that have been made out of boredom. They say boredom kills more than the enemy. Some of the Rangers tried to talk him out of this mission, but he indeed volunteered in early September. So there he was, disguised as a Dutch schoolmaster in search of work that he set out on his journey. He made his way through Connecticut to Norwalk. He crossed the Long Island Sound into Long Island and eventually made his way behind British lines. Within several days, he was captured. Exactly how he was captured still remains a matter of debate today. Some say that the infamous Ranger Robert Rogers, if you've seen Turn, you know who we're talking about here. They some believe that Rogers tricked Hale into revealing his identity. Basically, he had been observing this person who had not been, who seemed out of place where he was, and over drinks in a tavern got Hale to admit his true sympathies. Others say that it was Hale's cousin Samuel, who was a loyalist that knew of Nathan's patriot leanings and the fact that he had signed up to serve in the Continental Army that revealed his true identity to the British. Regardless of how it was done, it's not difficult to see that Hale's capture was the most likely outcome. First, he was known to all, including all of his friends, as an honest and honorable man, two attributes not typically associated with being a successful spy. Second, he carried with him his diploma, reportedly, that bore his own name. Hale's not a Dutch name. He didn't speak Dutch, and it is widely believed that he also had a powder burn under his right eye. If you have a powder burn under your right eye, that typically indicates that you're not a school teacher. You probably have to do something with carrying arms. You fire a musket, flash gets under your eye, and it sticks there. So you see that sort of thing in place. You have this honorable person with a pretty poor cover story and a powder burn. Something, the alarm bells are going to start ringing. And lastly, it's not even clear that Hale had any plan on how he was going to send the information that he collected back to Knowlton or to Washington, which meant that the intelligence that he collected would basically be greatly diminished in its value. None of this could hardly be blamed on Hale. There was no specialized school or course of instruction that taught tradecraft or methods. And even if there was only a minimal amount of time between Knowlton's request and the date that Hale embarked on his journey. Desperate times certainly called for desperate measures. But desperate measures can sometimes lead to disastrous results. The morning after his capture on September 22nd, 1776, Hale was hanged at a location in New York City. Some say it was City Hall Park, where his statue stands in the present day. 66 or 3rd Street, which today is marked by a Lululemon. I don't mean to make light of Nathan Hale. I'm definitely sorry about that. But he was never given the courtesy of a court-martial, and he was, like I said, he was executed the following morning. According to legend, his last words were, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Most modern historians, however, believe that his last words probably echoed a line from Cato, which was a play that was popular with Whigs of the time, that basically goes, "How beautiful is death when earned by virtue? Who would not be that youth? What a pity is it that we can die but once to serve our country." Sounds like an Ivy League graduate to me. Who would not? As you can see, basically the lines are the same, so there's not really a lot of sense in arguing over the exact wording of it. What Hale almost certainly didn't know is at the time of his death was that less than 1 week before, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton was killed during the Battle of Harlem Heights while he was out scouting British lines. Washington himself wrote of Knowlton in the following day's general orders, where he said, "The gallant and brave Colonel Knowlton, who would have been an honor to any country, having fallen yesterday while gloriously fighting." It's my belief that the diminished intelligence capabilities of the Continental Army at this time led to the ensuing, or at least contributed to the ensuing losses that they suffered throughout the fall of 1776. They fought to a stalemate at White Plains, and again, they had the loss of many soldiers at Fort Washington, and that which you see in this image over here on the wall. And then later, 4 days later, the American evacuation at Fort Lee, and the sources indicate that there was pretty poor intelligence leading up to that. The Americans did not know what the British intent was after the Fort Washington had fell. But today you can find statues, halls, buildings, parks, and much more named after Nathan Hale all throughout the country, and also to Thomas Knowlton. On the previous slide, I had a picture of Knowlton's statue outside the State House in Connecticut. And you can find one today in City Hall Park, right across the doors from of the actual building itself. And according to agency lore, at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, it is a tradition that intelligence officers who deploy overseas leave a coin, usually a quarter facing up, because Washington's the person that sent Hale on his mission, at the statue's base, as they believe that Hale will bring them good luck on their journey. Today, you can see Hale's last known writing, a letter to his brother Enoch, here in the museum's Path to Liberty exhibit, right around the corner from the exit right here. It's somewhat befitting then, in almost exactly 4 years to the day after Hale's capture and death, marauders, including John Paulding and Isaac Van Wert, near Tarrytown, New York, captured a British intelligence officer by the name of Major John Andre, who had been conspiring with Benedict Arnold to give up the American military installation at West Point that Arnold happened to command at the time. Soon, Andre was transported across the river to Tappan, New York. I happened to grow up right near Tappan, New York, and walk by these locations quite a bit. Andre had just met with Arnold near Stony Point, near present-day Haverstraw, though the vessel that Andre was to return to, the Vulture, was fired on by American cannons and forced to sail downriver. Left without a getaway, Andre made the fateful decision to travel in civilian clothes with a bunch of papers jammed into his nice fancy boots that had detailed plans and remarks on the American military installation at West Point. And it was this decision that, coupled with the fact that he came ashore under assumed name, John Anderson was what he had, that led his court-martial to conclude that Major Andre, Adjutant General to the British Army, ought to be considered as a spy from the enemy, and that agreeable to the law and usage of nations, he ought to suffer death. His request to be executed by firing squad was denied, and he was hanged in Tappan on October 2nd, 1780. You can still see the location where Andre was hanged. There's a stone that commemorates it, and for years that stone was actually desecrated repeatedly because people thought that Arnold was buried there and not Andre. Many years later, Andre was uninterred and brought over to England for a proper burial. But accompanying Andre and possibly contributing to his actual capture was a young man by the name of Benjamin Talmadge. Both scholars of the era and fans of Turn will likely recognize that Talmadge was one of the directors of the Culper Ring. I'm not going to go too far in depth on the culpers here. I'm not the expert on it, but what is significant about Talmadge in this instance is that he was a close friend of Nathan Hale while they were both at Yale, and they followed in similar footsteps. Both men became headmasters of schools in Connecticut after their graduation, and both men, when the war became more imminent, signed up for continental service and seeking to do more. It is often said that Talmadge's letter in 1775 to Hale, which read, "Was I in your condition, I think the more extensive service would be my choice. Our holy religion, the honor of our God, a glorious country, and a happy constitution is what we have to defend." This is often credited as one of the reasons why Hale volunteered for service when he did. But rather than expressing disdain for Andre and wishing for him a similar fate as Nathan Hale, Talmadge wrote to a fellow officer, "I never saw a man whose fate I foresaw, whom I so sincerely pitied. He is a young fellow of the greatest accomplishments, and he was the prime minister of Sir Henry Clinton on all occasions. He has let me know of almost every motive of his actions so fully since he came out on his late mission that he has endeared himself to me exceedingly. Unfortunate man. He will undoubtedly suffer death tomorrow, and though he knows his fate, seems to be as cheerful as if he was going to an assembly." In his memoirs many years later, Talmadge recalled that when I saw him swing under the gallows, it seemed for a time as I could not support it. I believe that the memoirs might actually even be in the Fraunces Tavern collection here. Historians widely accept that Talmadge spoke for more than just himself regarding Andre, and Washington himself wrote that Andre was more unfortunate man than criminal. But nevertheless, the articles of war were clear, and Andre suffered the same fate that many engaged in the clandestine service did. So if I haven't convinced you already, intelligence officers such as Thomas Knowlton, Talmadge, and yes, Andre too, played key roles in military operations in the greater New York area, but they certainly were not the only ones. After the Americans left New York, the focus of the war shifted to the battlegrounds of outside Philadelphia and to northern New York, ultimately culminating in the Battle of Saratoga later that fall. It was not around until the summer of 1788, when the British evacuated Philadelphia, that the intelligence war around New York City would once again pick up. At this time, officers such as Major Alexander Clough provided valuable information for Washington. Based on his excellent service in running a human network outside Philadelphia, Washington trusted Clough to orchestrate a human network around New York City to answer very specific questions that he had regarding British forces. To illustrate a comparison, this is almost exactly how the Army operates in the modern era. A commander develops a list of questions known as priority intelligence requirements that the intelligence officer and his staff then go out to try and collect. They do these through various methods. In the modern day, we have much more technological advances today to aid in this process. But back in the day, it would have been done through reconnaissance or scouting or human operations. The answers to these questions then help a commander to make an informed decision. That Washington was then employing a method of structured intelligence at this stage of the war is once more indicative of his growing ability to manage these intelligence services. But I also think it's a misconception created by popular media that intelligence agents are out there to find that one piece of information that turns the entire tide of a war. Most of the time, that's just not the case. You find one bit of information here and one bit there that you're using to put together a puzzle that will provide the commander with enough information to make an informed decision about what's happening. It's a lengthy, iterative process that takes many long hours, and it involves the presence of humans working at their utmost to collect it. It may not be as exciting, but it is nevertheless extremely important. No doubt wary from the Hale affair, Washington provided explicit instructions to Clough on how this network should operate. He made sure that each of them had a cover story. He desired that each of them memorize the questions that they carried into the city. And further, he wished that none of the agents should know each other. This means if one of them were captured, that not all of them would be compromised and the ring would still survive. And it just so happens that during the summer of 1778, Clough's network was able to answer all of Washington's intelligence questions and provided valuable intelligence that indicated that British forces were about to invade New Jersey, across the Hudson into New Jersey in search of forage. They were running low on military supplies throughout that summer. This was something of chief concern to Washington. The crossing did occur in late September 1778, and Clough did continue to serve as an intelligence agent, but mostly through traditional reconnaissance and scouting operations as the British pushed further and further into New Jersey. On September 28th, he and his commander, Colonel George Baylor, made the disastrous decision to encamp in a loyalist neighborhood near Tappan, now present-day Rivervale, New Jersey. The following morning, British forces under the command of General Charles No Flint Gray attacked the encampment using only their bayonets, befitting Gray's moniker. Legend has it that Clough attempted to hide in a large Dutch chimney, and he was ran through with a bayonet and succumbed to his wounds the following morning. He's buried on the grounds of the Dutch Reformed Church, which is coincidentally the same location where Major John Andre had his court-martial almost 2 years to the day later. Another officer charged with intelligence operations at this time was General Charles Scott, who was a Virginia native and later the fourth governor of Kentucky. At the same time, Clough had set up his base of operations on the New Jersey side of the river. Scott was attempting to do the same in Westchester. His correspondence, though, indicated that he was not having much success doing what Clough was. But then that September and October, he began providing a continuous flow of information through basically the work of Benjamin Talmadge and Light Horse Harry Lee. Lee and Talmadge gained this information through conventional means, such as human operations, but also by interrogating enemy deserters who had left the British lines. It was also around this time that Washington, through Scott, began receiving intelligence from Abraham Woodhull, who you might know today as Samuel Culper. Talmadge, who grew up in the same town of Setauket on Long Island as Woodhull, would soon take over as the primary handler for the Culper ring when Scott returned home to Virginia in November of 1778. Another individual that I have up here on the screen is Caleb Brewster. Many historians claim that it was actually Brewster who brought the ring into existence. In addition to his role with the Culper ring, Brewster was known to frequently operate via whaleboat on the Long Island Sound, where the frequency of smugglers that would travel on the waterways provided great cover for him to collect information on British forces. So you can kind of see an intelligence layout here throughout the summer of 1778. You had Clough over here in Bergen County in New Jersey, sending agents into New York City. You had Scott working with Talmadge and with Light Horse Harry Lee. You had Brewster out further towards Norwalk, where he'd transit the Long Island Sound. And you also had Washington communicating directly with a man named Thomas Wicks, who was a militia leader further out to the east on Long Island. Now, I mentioned that I was not going to go in depth about the Culper ring, but I do want to discuss some of their tradecraft because I find it very interesting. And also, I think it speaks to the innovative nature of intelligence operations at the time. By this point in 1778, it was very apparent what the consequences of spying were. I think I've covered that enough so far. They say necessity is the mother of invention, and staying alive is definitely a necessity, in my opinion. The first method to keep their messages secure was to use aliases. Woodhull went by the name Samuel Culper Sr. SC, Samuel Culper was inverse of Charles Scott's name, CS. Also, Culpeper, Virginia, was the county where George Washington grew up surveying, and he just shortened it to Culper for the name here. Rather unimaginatively, Robert Townsend, a merchant that operated in New York City near Hanover Square, which is actually only a couple blocks from where we are right now. It's known as Queen Elizabeth II Square, maybe about 30 seconds walk from outside this building, went by the name Samuel Culper Jr. And Talmadge went by the name John Bolton, not to be confused with the former national security advisor with the bushy mustache. The second method used to keep these messages secure was to use trusted couriers. As I mentioned earlier, Hale had no one to transmit his messages, nor did Enoch Crosby. For the Culpers, he would have two different couriers that would work for them. One was Jonas Hawkins, and the one that is more known is Austin Rowe, who would pick up messages from Townsend in Setauket and provide them to Brewster, who would bring them across the Long Island Sound to Talmadge, who would then bring them to Washington, wherever he was located. This was not the most efficient method of doing so, but it was definitely the most secure way of doing it at the time. But in early July 1779, an unfortunate incident forced Talmadge to get even more creative. On July 2nd, he lost nearly all of his papers after a British surprise attack. The following day, he wrote to Washington, who replied, "The loss of your papers was certainly a most unlucky accident and shows how dangerous it is to keep papers of any consequence at an advanced post. I beg you will take care to guard against the like in the future." I can tell you that's not something you want to hear from your commander. But soon Talmadge devised a code for his correspondence with the Culper ring. Not only had he created a list of 710 words, each with its own numeric identifier, but if the author needed to write a word that was not identified in the list, Talmadge had also created a unique alphabet, swapping out each letter for a different one. You can see a copy of one of the pages of his code book right here. And it's because of this code that we know that there was also a woman working with the Culper ring. Abraham Woodhull once wrote to Washington that 355 is one who hath ever been serviceable to this correspondence. 355 stood for lady, according to Talmadge's code book. The debate rages on as to 355's actual identity. Alexander Rose insists that 355 is Anna Smith Strong, a Setauket native who allegedly hung petticoats on the line to signal to Brewster that a message was ready to be picked up. Others insist that it must have been Robert Townsend's common law wife. But recent scholarship from Claire Bellergeau, who I believe just did a lecture here not too long ago, insists that 355 was actually an enslaved woman named Elizabeth, or Liz for short, that was enslaved by the Townsend family, again, relating to Robert Townsend, who was the merchant here in New York City. And that could have been the mysterious 355. Being an enslaved woman in New York at this time would definitely have made her inconspicuous and useful with enough placement and access to be a valuable intelligence agent. If you're interested more in her story, I highly encourage you to pick up a copy of Claire's book, Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution. Nevertheless, the practical effect of Talmadge's code was that even if one of the agents were captured, the information and the other identities in the ring would be secure. The culprits were not the only ones to use ciphers throughout the war, and in fact, Arnold and Andre used a cipher throughout their correspondence as well. Theirs was a sequence of 3 different letters. The first number in the code would be the page to look for in a particular book. The second would be the line to look for, and then the last number in that 3-digit code would be the word to look for within that. The books that he used were Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. If you're familiar with the law, we know that law students still study this today. And they later used Bailey's English Dictionary. Both of these would have been pretty common to have on your shelves and wouldn't have seemed too out of place to have. But let's take a look at an example of what the culprit code might have looked like. Anyone want to take a guess at what this says? Nothing too crazy here. This is a bit of a simplification. Sometimes the agents were not very skilled at writing in the code, and they would often write plain text and then encode particular words with the particular number in there. But I think it's more fun to do it this way. But what if someone were to stop an agent at a checkpoint with papers that have a bunch of these numbers written all over it? I know what I would think. This person's probably up to no good. So there had to be a way to pass these codes in a way that wouldn't be detected to the naked eye. The solution, well, it turns out that John Jay's brother, there we go, John Jay popping up again here, was a chemist by trade and had been working on an invisible ink for several years. The ink was referred to as white ink, or the sympathetic stain by George Washington, and would be used to write code between the lines of ordinary letters or on the backs of letters referred to as blanks. Washington often desired the whitest paper for these letters to be written on because that was the best way to reveal the ink that they were writing. The only way to reveal the message was to brush a counterpart solution known as a reagent over the paper that would reveal the underlying message. Previous attempts to use invisible inks, they could be heated up with, or if you heated them up, they would reveal the message, or if you applied a particular acid, it would reveal the message. But this was a little bit harder. You needed to have the reagent in order to reveal the code. But the creation of this ink did not solve all of the ring's problems. At several points, the ring ran low on its supply, sometimes from overuse and other times because of unfortunate accidents. For example, in April 1779, Talmadge wrote to Washington that Culper believed he was about to be caught by British officers that were staying in his own home. In a fright, he grabbed all of his belongings and knocked over his vial of invisible ink. But it were not British officers that were knocking at his door, but rather it was 2 women who sought to surprise him. Such an excessive fright and so great a turbulence of passion so wrought on poor Culper that he has hardly been in tolerable health since, Talmadge wrote. So, what were some of the other methods used by spies during the war? For that, we must discuss another ring that operated in and around New York City, though one that received far less attention than the Culpers. The Mercereau ring initially involved 4 members of the family. There was Joshua Mercereau, a shipbuilder and assemblyman on Staten Island, and his 2 sons, Joshua and John LaGrange. And there was also Captain John Mercereau, Joshua's brother. The Mercereaus provided intelligence to Washington throughout 1776, though it was mostly low-level information regarding fortifications and quantities of supply. There's also an interesting story that when the Americans escaped across New Jersey into Delaware, or across the Delaware River, that the Mercereau brothers had noticed the British boats and set them off into the ocean so that the British couldn't pursue them. When the Continental forces did evacuate New York and Fort Lee in November of 76, the Mercereaus were treated with the army, with the exception of John LaGrange, who remained in New Brunswick to collect on British forces. He managed to do this for several months before his mission was compromised and he was forced to relocate to Vermont. John Parker, the elder Joshua Mercereau's apprentice, was not so fortunate. He was captured by the British and starved to death in a New York City prison, perhaps one of the sugar house prisons that stood only a few minutes from where we are standing right now. And while it might be easy to blame the lack of guidance or training or formalized tradecraft, it may have just been dumb luck that the Mercereaus and their associates came under suspicion. But it does appear that the Mercereau ring created its own methods for transporting information at the time. And relative to that time, it was quite advanced. What they would do is they would tow these messages in bottles that had weights in them towards the back of their boats. And if they came under duress while they're out in the water, they would quickly let the message sink to the bottom of the ocean, and all the incriminating evidence would be lost to sea. Once they were received on either side of the channel, they would flash lamps across the water in a prescribed manner to signal that they were received. On some occasions, John LaGrange would often leave the information on a dead drop on Shooter's Island off the northern coast of Staten Island, in between New Jersey. Using dead drops as a practice that has been used throughout history and often involves putting a message into a concealed location known only to the intended recipient. You better pick something that is actually something you can find, or else that message might be lost to history. In this instance, John LaGrange used the underside of a large rock on Shooter's Island. Fortunately, I guess whoever was picking up the message was able to figure out which rock that was. You can see Shooter's Island on a map located right here. You can still see Shooter's Island today. Became a ship graveyard later on. There's a bunch of giant hulks of ships that sit outside of it in the modern era. Now, I know what you're probably thinking right now. You didn't come here to learn about Staten Island. Anyone here from Staten Island? No one? Okay, good. I was going to say that no, I'm from New Jersey. We know how to take a joke about where we're from. With the Mercer spread throughout New England by the end of 1777, the ring fell silent for several years. But then in 1779, Washington re-engaged the elder John Mercer, seeking to know the composition and disposition of British forces on Staten Island. But there was only one problem. Mercer no longer had access to Staten Island and was located primarily in New Jersey. By April 1780, Washington was again receiving regular detailed intelligence reports from Mercer, all of which were answering his key intelligence requirements. But this raises the question, how is he obtaining such detailed information? Mercer's agent on Staten Island wrote to him under the pseudonym Amicus Republica, which, as you might be able to guess, translates to friend of the Republic. In later years, Amicus was later determined to be a man named Abraham Banker. We know his identity because in later years he applied for a federal appointment from George Washington during his first administration. And in support of his application, he revealed that he was the one who penned the Amicus letters so many years before. As Washington's letters were not public, this could only been known to the actual writer. Banker resided in New York and on Staten Island throughout the course of the war, which gave him excellent access to information that Washington desired. At the time of his service as a spy, he was 20 years old, and his records indicate that he attended King's College, now Columbia University, and it is quite apparent that he was educated based on the quality of the letters that he wrote to Washington. In fact, Washington greatly desired that his correspondence continue. His access to New York and Staten Island was almost certainly because his father, Adrian, owned a home on Wall Street, again, not too far away from where we are right now. And in total, Banker wrote 8 letters as amicus throughout 1780. Most of these were answers to Washington's intelligence requirements that he passed through Mercer, though as Banker himself put it, they were mostly just plans of fortifications and other communications of an interesting and important nature. But in early June, he wrote of 2 potential plots that could threaten the Americans. The first was a planned British invasion of some part of New Jersey. Banker wrongly guessed Hackensack. That turned out to be the Battle of Connecticut Farms, in which the New Jersey militia halted British forces that had crossed from Staten Island into New Jersey and attempted to attack the primary American encampment at Morristown. The second was a plot to introduce counterfeit currency to depreciate the value of the Continental dollar. This was something that was a continuous problem for the Continental Army. And even though Washington had a very strict punishment for those that were caught counterfeiting, that was death if you were caught doing that. The British felt that if they could introduce enough Continental currency or counterfeit money into circulation, it would be exceedingly difficult for the army to purchase supplies that were necessary to sustain the war effort at the time. And this was particularly a constant issue around New York City because most of the counterfeiting materials or the counterfeiters were located in New York City. At one point, they even captured a box of the paper that the Continental dollar was printed on, so it looked almost identical to what the Americans had. What's unclear at this time is whether Banker's intelligence actually did anything at all to prevent any currency from circulating. The dollar was continuing to depreciate as it was. And in the summer of 1780, Banker nearly delivered what I believe was information that could have changed the course of a war, which I said before was not typically the case for these types of intelligence operations, but here it appears that he did. At a very minimum, it could have saved Washington quite a bit of heartache. He wrote to Mercer on June 24th with an urgent message. Sir Henry Clinton had recently returned to New York from Charleston and had taken up residence in Banker's own home. That's pretty good cover as a spy if you're if you're able to have the commander of the British forces lodge in your own home. And it put him in an excellent position to listen in on many of the important conversations that Clinton and his inner circle had. Evidently, Clinton spoke very openly about the current plans that they had in place, and Banker's letter contains this ominous message. The Grand Fort at West Point is said to be their object in view, as they esteem that a key to the eastern states, and fancy if they shall once be possessed of that passage, that they will be able to prevent all supplies coming to General Washington's army. They ridicule the opposition you are making to impede their progress, as they seem confident that the depreciation of your currency and the ill success that has attended your arms will give a final stroke to American politics. You must be very cautious for whom you trust, for you have internal enemies whom you consider as real friends. Very ominous. It is unclear whether Banker knew the identity of the internal enemies mentioned in this letter, and we can only speculate on who he's referring to. But if you'll permit me, I'm going to speculate. It is my belief that he was referring to a British officer, or the British officers were discussing a well-placed American officer who could deliver West Point to them. There was only one known American or officer corresponding with the British in that point in the summer of 1780, and that was Benedict Arnold. That Washington considered Arnold to be one of his genuine friends and one of his best generals, right up into his betrayal is further evidence that Arnold was the subject of Banker's letter. But less than 1 month later, Banker was again reporting on other prominent patrons with less than honorable intentions. On July 6th, Banker reported that Ethan Allen, who led the clothing store, and before then, the Green Mountain Boys, in taking Fort Ticonderoga in 1775, had been to New York City to conspire with the British. Allen at the time was embroiled in what became known as the Haldimand Affair, in which he attempted to establish Vermont as a British colony in response to Congress's refusal to grant Vermont statehood. Ultimately, and perhaps fortunately, the scheme was unsuccessful. Banker's contributions to the war effort are perhaps more significant because throughout the summer of 1780, the Culper Ring was on the verge of fracturing. That May, Talmadge wrote to Washington that Culper Jr., aka Townsend, here in New York, was declining to work for the ring any further because he feared for his safety. Woodhull on Long Island was also too growing timid of the work. Banker's work in New York thus filled an important role for Washington during that summer, even though the Culper Ring did manage to contribute some more information towards later in the fall. They say all good things must come to an end, and Banker too quit his work as an agent when Arnold defected to the British in September of that year. He was one of the many who had been spying for Washington that felt that Arnold may have known their identity. And when Arnold did betray the American cause, he kind of appointed himself to be the spy hunter in chief, as Alexander Rose puts it, looking for any person that might be spying for the American cause. So he was forced to leave New York, and he hid out on Staten Island for the remainder of the war, which greatly diminished his value as an intelligence asset. In later years, as I mentioned, he applied for a federal appointment under George Washington's first administration, though for reasons unknown, he was denied that appointment. Nevertheless, Banker never stopped serving his country and took part in the New York Convention for ratifying the Constitution, where he voted in favor of ratification, where the final vote tally was only 30 to 27. Certainly, this was not the life of a lowlife or a scoundrel. Can you guess the two people standing to his left and his right in this image? You get Banker in the center. Anyone know who this is? That's Hamilton, yep. And then, John Jay. Jay, in fact, became one of the very first secretaries of state. And at the time, Fraunces Tavern was the first Department of War. So that means that Jay carried out his service as Secretary of State in the exact building where we are right now. But was that the only connection to the American spy rings that Fraunces Tavern has? Definitely not. The gracious purchase of Fraunces Tavern by the grandson of Benjamin Talmadge, Frederick Talmadge, is the reason why Fraunces Tavern exists today. And you can see more about him in one of the exhibits outside. And also in connection to one of these spy rings at the time is one of the direct descendants of the Merceau ring. William H. Merceau was one of the preservationists that led that helped rebuild Fraunces Tavern in the early 1900s after it had been damaged by a fire. So you can see it, like they all have a connection to the location where we are right now, and I think that's pretty darn cool. So I started with a quote. And I think it's perhaps fitting that I end with another. There is nothing more necessary than good intelligence to frustrate a designing enemy, and nothing that requires greater pains to obtain. George Washington wrote this to a friend in 1756. If there's anything I want you to take away from what we just talked about, it's that espionage and intelligence operations were a dangerous activity, and that the men and women who carried out these operations bore the brunt of the great pains that Washington described. These may have been some of the lesser known spies and officers, but there are doubtlessly many more that have been lost to history, yet all of which played a role in securing the founding of this country. Who are these individuals? We may never know, and perhaps that's the most indicative sign that we have of their skill. So if you were a member of the Culper Ring and you were sitting in the crowd right now, you'd probably have sent me this message. Anyone know what this says? Thank you all for coming out here.
We have time for a few questions from the audience. I'll start with a question that came to us from Zoom. And Tara asks, were there any particular background or lifestyle patterns consistent with the most successful spies? For instance, were they well educated or moneyed, or were the profiles very diverse?
I'd say they're very diverse. You had someone like Hale, who is Ivy League educated, who was not very good as a spy, but you had someone who was Ivy League educated like Talmadge, who was good as an organizer of intelligence. But then you also have someone like Abraham Banker, who was very educated, and the fact that he was educated definitely contributed to the quality of his particular letters. And we're talking about more like the formal intelligence agents. You also had people that were carrying out human operations and served as sources for the Continental Army. And probably the best background that they could have was a merchant or someone that would have a plausible reason for being in New York.
Great. Any questions in the room?
I was looking at the portrait of Major Andre. It's a self-portrait.
Yes.
Did he do any other drawings?
He was known as an accomplished artist. Yes. Yeah. I think might be some in the collections here. Am I? No, he was. Yes, you can find a lot of them online. He was known for being a very social person. He had a lot of artistic talent to him. He was known as a bit of a dilettante, and he basically, his charisma and his charm and all these different qualities made him very endearing to the Americans, even though he was caught as a spy.
What spooked Robert Townsend and prompted him to drop out of the service?
I think that there was just a lot of activity going on in New York at the time, and when there was several instances with the Culper Ring where the letters were actually captured, and even though it was kind of hard to decipher them, the British were very wary that there was someone doing these particular services.
Is there anything to do with Hercules Mulligan being rearrested?
Mulligan's an interesting one because there's a lot of debate as to how connected he was actually to the ring itself. I couldn't. They did, yeah. They're operating in New York City, so they would have known each other. But how connected he was to the Culper Ring, it may have spooked him just the fact that someone that was spying for the opposite side was captured, and that would definitely spook someone, especially when you know what the penalty is for doing that.
So like operational security seems like really important, and like in the Abraham Banker case, like they were staying at a guy's house that was spying for the Americans. Do you have any sense of like what they would do and like how the spies would get around it? Like,
in terms of what? How do you mean?
Like safeguarding information. Like in that case, they were staying at a guy's house.
Right. So the Clinton and his officers were staying at Banker's own home and basically talking freely, is what it seemed. Which operational security was obviously important, but I think when they choose these particular locations where they would stay based on how safe that they thought they were. So obviously we learn a lot from the failures of operational security and make plans for the future. And Washington, as we saw on the other side, was constantly basically improving his foxhole the whole time, making sure that there's more plans in place and where he stayed and how he communicated was better protected. Doesn't look like the British were doing the same, but from what it appears from, I think, from Banker's letter is that while they were talking about what was going on, it doesn't appear that he revealed any particular name. So there's bits of information that were not divulged publicly that probably contributed to, or at least were in their minds when they were talking about these things.
Got another question from Zoom. We're going to do some back and forth. Someone asks, how far back in history do we know that codes existed?
Oh gosh, that is outside the scope of my research. But as far as I know, they've gone all the way back to the ancient times. I couldn't tell you the codes that existed in the Revolution were very rudimentary compared to even some of the early ones. I'm not a cryptographer or a cryptanalyst or anything by trade. There's people that talk about all the different flaws of the code that Talmage had put in place, and same thing with Arnold. But you're also talking about, codes are only as good as the people that could use them. And if you have people that have to write on, paper that had to be crumpled up and jammed in secret compartments of things that were being transported all over the place, you have to, and people that are doing it under low light conditions and hastily, it has to be something that's easy to use, but also safe enough. So yeah, these codes have existed forever. There's probably sources they could have learned from, but I think they made the best of what they had at the time. I don't know if that answered the question, but.
You mentioned Silas Dean a little earlier in your talk, and he did a lot of his spy work abroad, and there was quite a lot of a big spy ring there. And then there was a recent show that came out, Franklin, that did not even mention Silas Dean at all. And I was just kind of wondering, is it because of the way that his story ended that we've kind of dismissed his contributions, or?
I think so. Yeah, I know. I think that Silas Dean's a fascinating character and a misunderstood one that has largely been cut out of a lot of the American story because of what he wrote later on. And no one really actually kind of knows why he had wrote that or what the context was. They just know that it was published in an American paper, and he was banned from coming back. So yeah, I think that's an unfortunate story, and there's a lot that could be learned. When they sent Silas Dean abroad, I think this is fascinating. He didn't speak French. R. Franklin told him, "You'll learn it if you hang out with the French," which is a terrible way to send an agent abroad. But yeah, Silas Dean is an interesting character, and I think that series probably would have benefited greatly from including him. Yeah.
Really simple one. What is the image that you have on your screen?
Oh, this is a painting by, or a sketch by a British officer. This shows the British ships on between the Narrows of Staten Island and Manhattan.
Which side are we on here?
I believe we are on this side.
No, but I mean, is the right side Manhattan? I mean, Brooklyn? Or?
I believe this is looking from north to south, and this side is New York. The high side of the image.
Hi, thank you for all the research. Yeah, I read Benjamin Talmage's what do you call it?
Memoirs.
Yeah, his what his grandson gave his autobiography, and he said that John Major Andre was the reason why he knew he was British, not John Anderson, was his gait.
Yes, yeah, it's a cool story.
And then I think that the drawing is at the 76 Tavern, which was in the Mays Tavern in Tappan.
Yes.
Still there. That's where he was arrested, John.
Yes, oh, that was where he was kept. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's when he drew that illustration.
Yeah, no, I think that's
And also Townsend, this house is still existing.
Yes.
And you can see it as it's a museum. And he was a Quaker, he didn't want to fight, but when the British just overtook his house, that's when he.
Right, yeah, absolutely. You can still visit the Townsend family home in Raynham Hall on Long Island. It's a pretty great exhibit they have out there. And yes, I think that the Talmage memoirs provide a lot of really great context to Andre as a character. There's even a story that Talmage writes a lot later about his opinion of Andre. Allegedly, there was a story that both of them are where they're talking while Andre's awaiting execution, where Talmage allegedly tells Andre, "I once had a friend named Nathan Hale who suffered death and was hanged." And Andre replied to him, "Well, surely you don't think that our cases are alike." Andre claimed that he wasn't a spy. He just happened to be talking with Arnold on American shores in a different uniform, but he wasn't actually trying to collect anything while he was over there. And what Talmage replied was, "Yes, and you shall suffer the same fate." At least is what he claims by his memoirs. But when you look at the actual letters that he was writing at the time, they seem to be a lot more sympathetic to Andre's character. at the time. And it seems that they did talk quite a bit. And I think that the self-portrait on the morning of his execution is one of the most poignant, relics we have of the time that kind of indicate the gravity of what they were involved in.
I'll take one more question to close us out over here.
I suppose other than those that were caught, like Hale, how long was the identity and these codes kept secret to protect these people? And, like, I guess how long did it take for that information to become public? Not public. But...
Yeah, no, I think it wasn't until many years later that they actually discovered the actual identities of a lot of these people in the culprit ring. I couldn't tell you the exact date of how long it was later, but the culprit himself, even in his memoirs, doesn't write at all about the culprit ring. He mentions that he started a correspondence with people on Long Island for the purpose of serving General Washington, but talks nothing else about it. I don't know whether that was out of shame, because again, like the perception of spying was that it was not something that gentlemen officers did, but that was something that he didn't highlight chiefly. And Talmadge actually even weirdly served as the witness for a lot of people that were applying for pensions later on in the war, all of which tried to claim that their bona fides and the reason why they deserved a pension was supporting the American cause through spying or doing whatever else. In one instance, even the person that captured Andre across the river at Tarrytown, John Paulding, when he applied for a pension, Talmadge actually was someone that testified against him and said he doesn't deserve a pension for what he was doing, because he just happened to catch Andre. He was out there trying to steal from him, basically, not actually trying to seek out a patriot or a British spy. So all that to be said is that a lot of these things were not found out till many years later, and I guess that does speak to how well they kept this code and the fact that they kept quiet later on. That's right. That's right. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. People have kind of been piecing those pieces together, including very recent research, like I mentioned with Claire Bellergeau, about who the identity of 355 could possibly be. So we're constantly still learning. So hopefully, if any of your ancestors or your relatives find a sheet of papers in someone's attic, please let me know. Well, we can write the next chapter of the book.
One final question from me to you and for our audience here. Where can people find more of your work? Oh gosh. Well, you can find me at Fort Lee Historic Park. I'm there mostly every weekend. We do tours, we do other programs and whatnot. You can also find my work on the Journal of the American Revolution. I publish there every so often, and often other tours and events just like this, but mostly over New Jersey. So yeah. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation, and thank all of you here for joining us tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture and would like to stay up to date with all of our programs, you can join our mailing list by going to FrauncestavernMuseum.org. That's also where you can find our calendar of upcoming programs, including our upcoming 250th anniversary commemoration of the cannonball that was shot through the roof of Fraunces Tavern. That's another story. And thank you, of course, to those of you who have donated to the museum. Your support helps us fulfill our mission of sharing the history of the American Revolutionary era with the public. We would like to give special thanks to the lead sponsors of our 250th exhibition, Path to Liberty, The Emergence of a Nation. Those sponsors are Peter C. Hine and Ann Farley, William Hale Kirby, Mrs. Stanley DeForest Scott, and Stephen T. Whalen. If you would like to donate, you can also visit our website, FrauncestavernMuseum.org. And thank you all again for joining us at another Fraunces Tavern Museum lecture. We hope to see you all again soon.